Okay, so it's P1, Chapter 4, the First Islamic Community. We're talking about the B part questions. The question was, write briefly about the tasks carried out by the scribes of the revelation at the time of the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam. I've mentioned this to you in school also, that the scribes, remember the scribes that were present in Makkah were different from the scribes present in Medina. Clear? So when you remember to mention the Meccan scribes and the Medina scribes and how did they carry out their task and how did they compile the Quran, explain the importance of the principles. Now there were principles, there were set points that were employed by the compilers of the Quran at the time of the caliphs. In other words, the two caliphs, Hazrat Abu Bakr and Hazrat Uthman. Now, first of all, public announcement was made. Why was a public announcement made? Because, okay, if you see here, I've got, what do we have to, the principles, the scribes, Abu Bakr and Usman, like two caliphs and the scribes, what were the principles that they, and the importance of the principles. Public announcement. Why public announcement? So it would be a joint venture, basically. It wouldn't be just one man game that, okay, one person has decided all of a sudden to do this and he's done it and then be maligned for the rest of his life. No, public announcement was made. Majlis al-Shura was sat. It was decided in Majlis al-Shura that the Quran will be compiled. Then a public announcement was made so that this matter goes out from the Majlis al-Shura into the public. They all knew what was going on. And what happened, everybody agreed, yeah, this is something good, this is right. Because remember, to achieve anything at a huge level, you need public support. So after the public announcement, written pieces were collected from each and every person. Okay, what does that do? That makes people, the general public, also feel important. Imagine if like 100 people had written manuscripts with them and they said, okay, bring yours. So you're thinking, oh good, I'm also taking part in this huge, this really good work that is going on. So written pieces were all collected from the public. And these written pieces, they were compared with the memory of the Hufaz. They were compared. Why do you think it was important to compare it to the memory of the Hufaz? So that it could be verified naturally. Then two witnesses were brought forward. Two witnesses were brought forward. What's the importance of two witnesses brought forward? So that nobody can blame the person that is bringing a written manuscript that it could be wrong or he didn't write it. Two witnesses, they used to come and verify. What did they used to verify? That this person, we saw this person writing these verses in the presence of the Prophet ﷺ. So the authenticity, two witnesses, if they thought of this principle of bringing two witnesses, what was the importance of this principle? To maintain the authenticity of the verses of the Quran, basically. So these two witnesses come up and they say that we saw this person, whoever brought in written collected pieces, that they wrote these verses in the presence of the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam. Okay, then a verbal and written testimony was given. Verbal means to say by your mouth, to verbally say it, and written is to write something down. A written and verbal testimony by the person who was bringing it in. He also brought two witnesses, also wrote down that I wrote these. It's like certifying yourself or verifying yourself that I wrote these verses. I swear by the name of Allah that I wrote down these verses in the presence of the Prophet ﷺ. Why was all this done? To maintain the authenticity of the Quran, basically. And so that in the coming, when it's compiled, nobody objects to it. If we go to, then the verses were put in order. That was the first principles were, first of all, during the time of Hazrat Abu Bakr, the verses were put in order. By divine guide, according to the divine, instruction. They were put in order during Hazrat Abu Bakr's, compilation at that time. But the surahs were not put in order. The surahs were just put into separate portfolios and they were just collected together. The initial thing was the initial aim of during that time of Hazrat Abu Bakr was to get the surahs and have the verses in order in each and every surah. So what they did, they compiled different surahs with the proper verses, and then they just put them all, stack them all together. This initial book was called the It was the initial book. Then surahs in order. Then during the time of Hazrat Usman, what happened was that people started debating about the proper dialect. Whereas it is mentioned in the hadith that the Quran has been revealed in 7 dialects. In other words, 7 different accents. For example, if I explain to you, we live in Pakistan, and suppose we take the word aap, or we take the word tum. So imagine some places tum is used as tu, some places they say te, some places it's tusan. Like, so can you see what, no matter how you pronounce it, it still means the same thing. So the Quran was revealed as 7 dialects, right? 7 accents, because there were 7 accents of Arabs. But what happened was when Islam, spread out during Umar's time to far off lands up to Azerbaijan and up to Europe, what happened? They were adopting the dialect that they were taught. And what happened was 2 people were debating about the difference of dialect. One person was narrating in the dialect of Syria, and one person was, reciting the Quran in the Kufi dialect. So they were about to quarrel about it. So then the matter was brought to Hazrat Usman, and then it was agreed again in Majlis-e-Shura that the Quran will be compiled in the Qurayshi dialect. Why the Qurayshi dialect? Because it was revealed to Hazrat Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam in the Qurayshi dialect. So that's why they thought, okay, to remove all of these differences, let's compile it let's make it into a standard copy based on the Qurayshi dialect. Now that was a principle that had to be employed. If this wasn't employed at that time, then what would have happened? There would have been differences created within the Muslims, and then even from externally the Muslims would have been maligned that, see, the Quran is, some places it's with a zair and some places with a zabar. So to even remove the external threat that could have been occurred because of different dialects, the Quran being in different dialects, that's why Hazrat Umar employed this principle of gathering the Quran on the Qurayshi dialect, burning all the Qurans that were available in different dialects. Now, remaining dialects destroyed. This decision was also made in the Majlis-e-Shura, because if they would have buried it, I mentioned this before, if they would have buried it, suppose they would have buried the Quran and not burn it, and imagine it's excavated 1,000 years later, and what would people do? People were saying, oh yeah, these people claim that their Quran is still the same. Look, it was written differently. They have different versions of the Quran. So that would have been a big fitna for Muslims, right? So the only way to destroy each and every dialect was to burn it. And this was decided in the Majlis-e-Shura. So every other Quran based on a different dialect was burnt. So that it turned to ashes, and then the ashes were, buried in the soil, right? That was a very necessary principle in order to safeguard, the Quran, and from further being, used against Muslims, that you have different versions of the Quran. This was very necessary. And then during this time, 7 copies of the were written down, and 7 people, I think 4 people worked on it, and then they were distributed to 7 different provinces of the Islamic Empire. And now this time was the time when the surahs were all put in order according to the divine order that the Prophet ﷺ had recited, and the Hufaz had memorized the Quran, and then the final book form of the Quran was formed. These were all of these different principles that were applied to compile the Quran during 2 different caliphs were very necessary, all in order to save the authenticity of the Quran. I hope I answered the question.